friends and colleagues in Africa. My name is Imani Countess, and I'm the director of a new initiative, the U.S. Africa Bridge Building Project. I'm also a member of the Advocacy Network for Africa, or ADNA, and today's event is part of a series organized by ADNA, webinars designed to provide opportunities to explore different aspects of US policy to Africa, as well as to be a conduit for African leaders in the policy, advocacy, human rights, and civil society spaces to share analysis, research, recommendations from the continent, and importantly, to figure out how we can build our collective power for action. This year, ADNA has organized webinars on Africa and the new Biden administration, COVID in Africa, and Pan-African approaches. ADNA, along with our presenting organizations, Africans Rising, which is streaming this event via Facebook Live, Friends of Angola, and the U.S. Africa Bridge Building Project, welcome you to this event, Stop the Bleeding, Curbing Illicit Financial Flows from Africa. The Africa that many of us know is one of abundance. The continent is known for its natural resources, strategic minerals, and phenomenal human resources. Yet Africa is a continent with the largest number of people living in extreme poverty. And how is it that a continent with abundant resources has a majority of people living on less than $1.90 per day? Nearly 50 years ago, Walter Rodney, a historian, political activist, and academic, wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It was an influential book then, and today continues to be a significant reference. In the book, Rodney talks about underdevelopment. Some prefer the designation developing countries. But he notes that development is not stagnant. Regardless of the circumstances, people are always developing. He acknowledges that some countries are going to be wealthier than others. And most importantly, he describes underdevelopment as a way to express a relationship to exploitation. In 1972, he wrote that the reasons for the underdevelopment of any African nation are not to be found inside that nation. Rather, within countries, we find the symptoms of underdevelopment. Illicit financial flows, an umbrella term coined roughly within the past couple of decades, also captures a relationship of exploitation. And that's what we will explore today. The current policies, systems, and mechanisms that are working together to facilitate harmful and illicit capital flight from Africa. The methods are complicated. They range from tax strategies to commercial practices of transfer pricing and trade mispricing. In 2020, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development wrote that Africa loses nearly $90 billion each year because of these practices. They also wrote, illicit financial flows rob Africa and its people of their prospects, undermining transparency and accountability and eroding trust in African institutions. Our three presenters will explore in more detail the scope of the problem, the impact on a country, Angola, and the role of the US in its foreign and domestic policies and its position as home to an assortment of illicit financial flow enablers. This is an opportunity to explore the less visible actors who are engaged in siphoning resources from the African continent. And each of the presenters and I will discuss actions that we can take. The issues feel big, complicated, and they are. But our colleagues are going to help break this down, and together we can figure out where we go from here. We are really delighted to have three senior level experts to address the question. And I'll tell you a little about each presenter and the specific issues they will address. However, before beginning, I want to acknowledge the visible imbalance on this panel by raising the obvious question. How in the world in 2021 can we have a panel of experts with no female presenters? This was not our design. but scheduling challenges prohibited the women we invited from attending. With this acknowledged weakness, I'm sure that our brothers in the struggle will do the best that they can. Our keynote speaker is Alvin Musioma. He's the founding executive director of Tax Justice Network Africa, a Pan-African advocacy and research network of 31 members in 16 African countries who are working on tax justice and curbing illicit financial flows from Africa. Alvin is a leading voice on tax policy in Africa, and for over a decade has spearheaded numerous civil society campaigns in Africa. Alvin will help us define IFFs, describe what they are, the impact on Africa, and what continent-wide bodies, national government, civil society, and social movements are doing to fight the flows. And Alvin will speak for about 20 minutes. Florindo Chivukut will follow Alvin. Florindo is the founder and executive director of Friends of Angola. Florindo founded Friends of Angola in April 2014. He has designed and implemented a number of projects as part of efforts to strengthen the capacity of civil society to empower women and youth while promoting nonviolent civic engagement by using new and existing technologies in Angola. Ian Gary will wrap up our panel. Ian is a senior level policy professional with more than 25 years experience in the international development and human rights fields. He joined FACT late last year after directing Oxfam America's Power and Money theme and the policy advocacy program and research work designed to improve the transparency and accountability of financial flows in order to address poverty and reduce inequality. Florindo and Ian will have about 10 minutes each. Each will speak in the order described, and then we will open up for at least 30 minutes of discussion. So, Alvin.
Thank you very much, Imani, for the kind introduction. Let me first, actually friends of mine had banned me from speaking in a men-only panel. And if they're going to see me speaking here, I think I'll have a lot of explanations to do. And I think I'll push that to you. I think once they get called, I'll direct them to you. But nevertheless, really a great honor, opportunity to be able to join this forum, to be able to present some of the perspectives on this very critical issue. As introduced, Alvin is my name. I work for the Tax Justice Network Africa, but here I'm speaking not just as TJNA, but as a representative of the Stop the Bleeding campaign, which, with your permission, I'll briefly introduce. The Stop the Bleeding campaign is a consortium collective of 6 organizations that was established and launched in 2015 and brings together 6 Pan-African organizations, including Trust Africa, which some of you might be familiar with, Femnet, which is a women a feminist organization based in Nairobi, the International Trade Union Confederation of Africa, which is a collective of trade unions from across the continent, Aphrodite, which is a debt network that focuses on issues around debt, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, and of course TJNA, which is currently acting as Secretariat of the Stop the Bleeding campaign. And together we have been working together with these other organizations to try and push the illicit financial flows agenda forward. And we were established on the sidelines of the towards the run-up of the high-level panel report, the so-called Mbeki panel report, which, as you might know, was came out around 2015 with the key recommendations on what African governments and also the international community should and must do to curb the challenges that are related to illicit financial flows. So civil society organizations came together to try and see how do we hold our leaders accountable to the commitments they have made under the African Declaration on illicit financial flows. It's also on that capacity that I speak here today. I'll start by actually building up on the point that Imani made about providing a context to the question of illicit financial flows, and I think that it's important that to understand illicit financial flows from the broader context of resource extraction. I think we'll be missing a big point if we don't locate the question of illicit financial flows or the conversation of illicit financial flows within the broader context that has defined the relationship, Africa's relationship to the world. And I think that the works of Walter Rodney is really very seminal around this, particularly for the African continent. I think it's important to note that the relationship the Africa has had with the world has been historically defined or characterized through the lenses of resource extraction and resource exploitation, made possible through economic, political, social, and to some extent, military dominance. And I think that the illicit financial flows is important that it's contextualized and seen as part of this larger struggle for the continent. And we go back as far as slavery, which is some form of human exploitation, colonization as part of that. The continued exploitation of physical resources, be they natural resources, minerals, oil, forestry, that many of the African countries are endowed with. If you look at, for example, the question of the knowledge resource, the exploitation of African intellectual property, the whole conversations we have had about the impact of brain drain in the continent. So it is in this space, I think, that we need to locate the conversation of illicit financial flow, and therefore IFF should be seen as a subset of the continued resource extraction from the continent, the continued exploitation of the continent, and indeed other countries of the South that is directly intertwined with the social, political, economic development historically, but also to the present. That I think is an important starting point. It's also important to note that the conversation of illicit financial flows really entered into the international development discourse in the early 90s. This was a time around when we saw a growth and an emergency of an almost oligopolistic market that had been accelerated by mergers and acquisition that led into an emergence of very strong what others have called corporatization of the global economy. And in developing world, the coming of the so-called Washington consensus that led to broad liberalization, privatization, and market deregulation. All this came at the same time when the notion of the idea of illicit financial flows and resource flows from the continent really started getting into the public economic discourse and political discourse. Before that, the question of resource flows was really seen from the north-south lens and really characterized from the prisms of capital flight, and which really should not be confused with illicit financial flows, because capital flight was understood as capital escaping from poor countries due to either political instability or business uncertainty and other push factors. And as a result of that, really led to, again, connecting it to the deregulation we saw, which were really the narrative that was being shaped, that developing countries and African countries need to do everything in their power to create an enabling environment that then will stop the capital flying out of the continent and creating basically investment regimes and investment agreements that we saw that were being signed at that particular time, all driven by this notion that the continent was losing its resources as a result of its own making, because we were not creating an enabling environment investment and foreign direct investment. This was really also part of the foundation of the whole narrative that shaped the Washington consensus. So the emergence of illicit financial flows really was also to kind of challenge this narrative, because it created a narrative that showed that although yes, the developing countries were on the receiving end of the resource outflow, it was not largely out of their own doing, but the responsibility lied at the recipient countries. And this really connects very well to the introductory points that Imani was making about looking where the problem was. If you take the example here of corruption, for example, in terms of how we have understood the geography of corruption, big part of that definition has been arguing that the problem of corruption lies with the African elite, with the African leadership that are basically looting and looting their country, which is really only part of the argument. If you look at where the direction of those corruption money is going, if you look at the destination, if you look at the channels through which this corruption money flows, it really, the illicit financial flows conversation opened and started challenging some of these dominant narratives about resource flow from the continent. And I think we are not yet there. I think there's a lot of resistance. For example, if you connect it to how the question of how do we define illicit financial flows, how do we what is the understanding of what IFF is? There are those that have been pushing for a very narrow definition of illicit financial flows, wanting to look at it from the lenses of what is quote unquote illegal, looking at corruption, looking at money laundering, drug trafficking, and this is some of the positions institutions such as the IMF, the UNODC, the US itself. I think even under the two previous regimes where they were talking of the term illicit finance. There was actually at that time an initiative that was led from the State Department that was trying to support African government address the challenge of illicit finance, which left out the flows component, and that was deliberate, because again, this notion that the problem of illicit finance can only be solved if Africans or developing countries put their houses in order, and avoiding to look at the tentacles through which the global financial system that has created the enabling environment for these resource flows to occur. So civil society organizations and other progressive entities, including UNCTAD, UNDESA, and indeed the African High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows, has been advocating for a more broader definition of illicit financial flows that includes tax abuse, that includes aggressive tax avoidance by multinational companies. And this really makes it even more important when you look at, if you were to break down the different sources of illicit financial flows, were to realize that over 65% of the component of illicit financial flows results from activities of multinational companies. And therefore, this narrow definition, of course, leaves out the bigger chunk of the problem. And that's why leading African institutions and civil society organizations, even globally, there has been a push for a more broad understanding and a more broader definition of illicit financial flows. And therefore, even the solutions that we are seeking are also encompassing the activities that involve illicit financial flows. So in summary, really looking at categorizing illicit financial flows, not purely on the activities themselves that are illegal, talking about corruption and tax evasion, but also encompasses the acts, the results of those acts. For example, when you talk about smuggling, trafficking of minerals, wildlife, and human trafficking, and even expanding that to look at what those resources are used for, in terms of the purpose of that. So having a more broader understanding of the framing of illicit financial flows. This becomes important, colleagues, if you look at where the solutions lie and what kind of solutions we need to adopt, because there has been going back to the 2015 conversation around the finance for development, there was that question of how do we anchor the question of illicit financial flows within the sustainable development goal conversation. And there were discussions about saying that this framing of broader illicit financial flows will make it difficult to achieve because they are not measurable. They are not, some of them go within the gray area of what is actually perfectly legal. So there was a lot of resistance to that kind of effort for a narrow definition. And indeed, institutions right now, there are efforts by organizations such as UNECA and UNCTAD to come up with tools that are aimed at measuring illicit financial flows. In terms of impact, of course, what we have seen is that over the last decades, illicit financial flows by itself has contributed to a rapid growth in inequality globally, but also in developing countries. The levels of wealth concentration that we have seen is a big part, a result of the kind of the relationship that illicit, the challenge that illicit financial flows has created. There have been statistics and numbers about, in the US about the top 1%. We saw that movement in the early 90s in the African continent. The colleagues from the Fighting Inequality Alliance that are here, I think the conversation about how the relationship between illicit financial flows and the wealth concentration and the rising inequality, I think is one that cannot be separated. Secondly, I think in terms of its ability to undermine the capacity of countries, particularly in the global south, to harness their potential to generate domestic resources to finance their own development, and hence contributing to creating the current and perpetuating the kind of dependency that we are seeing, aid dependency and dependence on external financing, which of course it does not come as a gratis or on free, but comes with a lot of conditionalities that are attached to it, and also linking it to what I was saying earlier about the resource extraction. And some of this, we see the role that China is playing in terms of providing aid, but in return, getting access to some of the natural resources that some of these countries have. So illicit financial flows in that regard has significantly contributed to perpetuating the kind of dependency syndrome that we see in many African countries. In terms of the patterns of illicit financial flows, I think that there is an attempt to create a moral equivalence between when defining solutions, when you are in these global spaces where the conversations on the solutions of illicit financial flows are being held, it's as if we are all on the same boat. And the arguments that civil society organizations have been making is that we might be facing the same storm, but we are definitely not on the same boat. And the reason for this is that, as I was saying earlier, 60% of over 65% of illicit financial flows is a result of corporate activities that involve tax evasion and tax avoidance and aggressive tax avoidance. And of these, OECD countries are responsible for over 68% of the world corporate tax abuse. So the challenge of illicit financial flows has winners and losers, and this sometimes misses in the global discourse, where solutions like, for example, what we are discussing now about the global tax minimum, we tend to assume that once we have these global solutions, everyone will benefit the same. And unfortunately, that is not the case. We see, when you look at challenges that are related to, be it on abusive transfer pricing, on the double tax agreement, the network that has been created globally that should, in its foundation, provide opportunities to avoid double companies being taxed twice, has led to companies avoiding paying tax at all, what is known as double non-taxation. And this is really the reason being that those treaties are being significantly abused. My own organization, for example, we have been fighting against some of these double tax agreements that African countries have signed with particularly secrecy jurisdictions, Mauritius, and other Singapore and others across the world that are really opening up African countries to aggressive profit shifting, where companies are actually conducting economic activities in African countries, but the profits are being declared in jurisdictions that are considered to be tax haven. And as a result of that, we are seeing a significant shift of revenues and erosion of tax bases of many African countries. Tax incentives presents another avenue where, in the effort to attract foreign direct investment, building again from this notion that African countries are too poor to build their own capital base, and therefore they need to do everything in their power to attract FDIs, has resulted to a race to the bottom, where countries are providing wide range of tax incentives aimed at attracting these investments and significantly contributing to eroding their own tax bases. You have companies that are operating year in, year out without paying their requisite taxes they're supposed to pay. The digital area, with the era that we live in, the digitalization of the global economy has presented the continent with, on one side, an opportunity, but a big challenge at the same time. We are seeing a huge shift of global trade to the digital sector, but the capacity and the ability of countries to capture revenues from the digital economy is facing significant resistance. There have been efforts that under the OECD that are being proposals under the table in terms of what needs to be done to tax the digital economy, but because of the concentration of power, particularly under the auspices of the OECD, again, is a situation where developing countries are receiving the weak end of the stick. We have seen anecdotal examples in the continent of countries trying to introduce particular strategies to capture revenues from the digital economy, but this has faced significant resistance, even threats from some, either the multinational companies or the countries where some of these digital companies emanate from. I'll spend a few minutes to discuss some of the progress because I realize we're running out of time. In terms of what we see on one side is that if you were to look at over the last 10 years, the challenge of illicit financial flows has actually grown. If we look at the magnitude, the high-level panel report of 2015 talked about $50 billion escaping the continent annually as a result of illicit financial flows. The UNCTAD report speaks of about $90 billion. That's the report of 2020. So the problem is getting worse. But the solutions, unfortunately, the evidence we have is largely anecdotal. So we have situations or anecdotal evidences of countries implementing pieces of legislation that are aimed at curbing illicit financial flows. An example I would give is in Kenya, for example. Kenya, Ghana, Tanzania, and South Africa are introducing legislation that is linked to beneficial ownership. We have seen efforts to harmonize tax policies and address challenges that are linked to harmful tax competition at the sub-regional level. ECOWAS and SADC, the measures, as I was speaking about, to tax the digital economy, some of these measures that have been put in by Kenya and South Africa. But all these examples remain anecdotal examples. We don't have, as a continent, a systematic mechanism of tracking these policy reforms. And these some of the conversations we have had under the Stop the Bleeding campaign of developing tools that we're able to see what actually are countries doing in a systematic manner. The African countries have organized themselves under the IFF consortium that emanated out of the Becky panel report as a platform to share experience and share expertise and in terms of what each organization or each entity is doing. And this forum has actually contributed significantly to the kind of collaboration we're seeing even under the Stop the Bleeding. As I move to the tail end of my presentation, I think it will be important to talk about the structural challenges that we are facing at the global level. I think that we will not be able to address the challenges that are linked to illicit financial flows if we don't focus on structural reforms that are required. There has been effort towards creating a universal governance system to reform the broken global tax system. But these reforms are faced efforts such as the Stop the Bleeding campaign and the Building Bridges initiative, I think, are critical in terms of creating a platform that target some of these blocker countries in terms of the kind of reforms that we are pushing for. Lastly, when it comes to the question of political capture, I think the primary reason that we are not making headway in the implementation of some of the agreed solution is not because we don't know what the problems are, but it is seldom, it's in the interest of those that either dominate the political institutions who are the beneficiaries of the current system. So the question that then emanates out of that, how do we break this resistance? I think number one, the question of transparency is going to be key. There is a political momentum that has been created, particularly resulting to the current COVID crisis, as governments come under pressure to collect more, to invest into weak economies. I think this is an opportunity as activists that we need to utilize to ensure that we are pushing for more transparency. The idea of political organizing, I think, is very, very important. The need to move beyond technical conversations and make this a political conversation, and that's what umbrella organizations such as TGNA, but also the Stop the Bleeding campaign is all about, turning these technical conversations into political conversations, because really the biggest impediments are political impediments, is the lack of political will, both at the national but also globally, and this cannot be achieved through purely technical arguments, but more important, through political pressure. It's only through that we can be able to break the resistance and ensure that we are working all together to build the bridges that we need to build to achieve the solutions of tackling illicit financial flows, particularly from the continent. I'll stop there. Imani, I hope I've not spoken more than the 20 minutes I was allotted, and I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alvin. Yeah, in 20 minutes, you packed a lot for us to think about. Appreciate that, and look forward to coming back to you in the discussion period. And now we'll hear from Florindo. Florindo, you're on mute. Okay, looks like we might be having a technical difficulty. Florindo is joining us from Angola. And so while we try to sort out the network and technical details, why don't we shift to Ian and hand everything over to you.
Okay, thanks, Imani, and thanks to the Advocacy Network for Africa, the Advocacy Network for Africa Accountability Working Group, the U.S. Africa Bridge Building Project, Africa's Rising, and Friends of Angola for the invitation. Really excited to be part of this conversation because as Imani, you and Alvin rightly noted, the US is a big part of the problem. And as Americans, we must be pushing our own government to be part of the collective solution to international financial flows. As it stands now, our financial system is far too open to illicit financial flows, harming both the US and other countries. As Global Financial Integrity has said, every dollar that leaves one country must end up in another. Very often this means that illicit financial outflows from developing countries ultimately end up in banks in developed countries like the US and the United Kingdom, as well as tax havens. One of the things I want to focus on today is anonymous shell companies, because they're so key to facilitating illicit financial flows that Alvin discussed. If you want to protect your illicit cash, the US is currently the easiest place in the world to set up an anonymous shell company. These companies are used for many nefarious purposes, such as corruption, tax evasion, as Alvin mentioned, drug trafficking, human trafficking, defrauding the US government. And beyond shell companies, we're also struggling in the US with issues related to money laundering and real estate transactions and private investment funds. And these are emerging issues that the FACT Coalition is working on. And if you've seen some of the news reports over the last few years, you know that many African rulers, such as the family of President Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, have bought mansions in the US, the family of the president of Gabon. You can go to nearby Potomac, Maryland, and see some of these properties. And it's important to keep in mind that the US is really providing a lot of enablers for illicit financial flows: the lawyers, the accountants, the consulting firms. Luanda Leaks, which I'm sure that Florinda would talk about, was a leak of information about how Isabel dos Santos in Angola was able to work with a global network of consultants, lawyers, bankers, and accountants to help park her assets abroad. And some of these are the leading professional services firms you know of, like PricewaterhouseCoopers. And even though there were obvious red flags about the source of this money, PwC worked with her and at least 20 companies controlled by her and her husband to stash this money away. That's just one example. But it's important to keep in mind that IFFs harm both Americans as well as Africans and people all over the world. In the US, shell companies have been used for human trafficking, to facilitate the work of drug cartels. Anonymous shell companies are used in perpetrating fraud against the US government, including related to COVID relief in the past year. This is something that the FACT Coalition member, the Project on Government Oversight, has been highlighting. These anonymous shell companies and IFFs distort real estate markets. Illicit financial flows and money laundering harm US workers. For example, crooks and oligarchs from other countries buying hotels, steel mills, and other properties as a way to park money. The recent leak from FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Intelligence Network in the US, showed how money transferred into the US from a Ukrainian oligarch funded some of his purchases in the US, and they used shell companies set up in Delaware. Just a couple of examples. The city of Cleveland gave $1 million loan to this Ukrainian tycoon for a hotel property in Cleveland. He bought a Kentucky Steel alloy factory. Prices for that have been surging over the last year, but workers have been laid off. So it has real impacts for US workers, for US citizens, and for the US government. As Alvin rightly says, tax evasion costs the US Treasury as well as treasuries around the world. But I think it's important to also note that some change is coming, which I'm happy to talk about, and the FACT Coalition has been at the forefront of that change. What I wanted to highlight today is a recent victory to pass the Corporate Transparency Act, which will largely ban anonymous shell companies from being set up in the US. I joined FACT, as Imani noted, as executive director in November. This was at the tail end of a 10-year plus push to set up a registry of beneficial owners for companies and to end this practice of anonymous shell companies. FACT is a nonpartisan alliance of more than 100 state, national, and international organizations, including Friends of Angola and the US Africa Bridge Building Project more recently. And we really believe that democratic societies are underpinned by fair tax systems, and where tax systems are unfair, corruption and kleptocracy and inequality are the results. So looking at this issue of shell companies, the US enacted the Corporate Transparency Act on January 1st, which will require all companies to report their true beneficial owners to the US government. This information, while not being public, will be available to the US government, but also law enforcement, both in the US and around the world. So there are opportunities for collaboration across borders. The US Corporate Transparency Act simply requires that companies and LLCs and other similar entities, the true owners, disclose their name, date of birth, and other information to identify them. Many observers thought this would never happen. And as Alvin said, there's a lot of political opposition to fixing the structural causes of illicit financial flows. But we were able to assemble a broad range of organizations to make this happen. That included anti-corruption groups, environmental groups, international development groups. And I think one of the key lessons here is that getting that broad range of organizations, not simply those groups that are devoted to this particular issue, and finding ways to talk about the issue in ways that are accessible to citizens around the world, and finding new audiences and new messengers. I think as part of our campaign, it was really important that we have a strong evidence base to present the issue as a key problem. Early on, the World Bank presented a study that said that the US shell companies were used in more grand corruption cases than those of any other country. We also found that, for example, it requires less information to set up a shell company in the US than it does to get a library card in all 50 states. We also worked off key media moments such as the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, Luanda leaks. So collaborating with investigative journalists was hugely important. But also, as I mentioned earlier, trying to find ways to put a human toll to illicit financial flows. So for example, we partnered with an organization called Polaris, who works on, they work on human trafficking and sex trafficking, looking at the link between illicit financial flows and human rights abuses. So there are a variety of ways that we were able to make this issue understandable to a broad population. In the end, we were able to bring on board some of the business groups, such as the banking industry, real estate, and even the US Chamber of Commerce, which had been previously opposed to this legislation. So looking forward, while this is a huge achievement, those of us in the FACT Coalition don't believe we've actually won on this issue until the US Treasury fully implements the law. And the Treasury Department has a year to implement this law. We're looking at key political moments over the course of 2021 that we can link to the implementation of this law. For example, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Corruption in June, or the G7 meeting also in June, could be a key moment for the US to put forward not only proposed regulation for the Corporate Transparency Act, but also other commitments to addressing illicit financial flows. We've seen, fortunately, that since the Biden administration has come into office, they've said that making anti-corruption and the fight against kleptocracy is central to supporting democracy, not only in the US, but around the world. Last week, we just saw Biden's budget proposal, at a top level indicated increased funding for the U.S. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. That is our financial intelligence unit in the U.S. It has been significantly under-resourced. It gets more than 2 million suspicious activity reports a year, and there's no way that they are able to take action on some of the issues raised in those reports with a staff of only 300 people. We're also keenly looking at the ways that the global Magnitsky sanctions can be used to address corruption and human rights abuses that are part of the illicit financial flows issue. Some of you may know about the case of Dan Gertler in the Congo, who is behind some of the biggest mining and oil deals in the DRC. He had sanctions put against him in 2017, but at the very end of the Trump administration, those sanctions were mysteriously lifted. FACT joined a mobilization of other organizations in the US to lobby the Treasury Department once Biden came into office, and we had those sanctions put back into place. So I think one of the areas where we can collaborate between Africa and the US is highlighting those cases that you think really need to be addressed through sanctions against individuals who are involved in corrupt acts or human rights abuses, in many cases linked to illicit financial flows. There's so much more we can discuss in terms of the agenda this year and the key political moments, but just to note, and I'll put some of this in the chat, that if you're in the US, your organization is very welcome to join the FACT Coalition. As I mentioned, the US Africa Bridge Building Project and Friends of Angola have recently joined. So joining our coalition and being part of our campaigns to stop illicit financial flows and support the US as part of the solution and not part of the problem. If you're an individual signing up for action alerts with the FACT Coalition and contacting your members of Congress about pending legislation, there's so much opportunity this year, including the full implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act, getting public country by country reporting of the taxes paid by companies to crack down on profit shifting and tax avoidance that Alvin mentioned, making sure we have the appropriate funding for anti-corruption work by FinCEN, funding for the IRS to go after multinational tax cheats. And then finally, there's some innovative legislation that's also been introduced already this year, one of which is the Crook Act, which would take a portion of the fines that multinational companies pay as a result of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violation, where they've been found to bribe foreign government officials and put those funds into activists, funding for activists in Africa and other parts of the world to combat corruption. So there are a lot of innovative ways and a lot of opportunity this year for you to become involved. So with that, Imani, I'd like to turn it over back to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I already see that there are a couple of hands raised for questions and at least one question in the Q&A box. And just want to let folks know that we are holding responses until all of the presenters have had an opportunity to speak. We do have Florindo back with us. He is experiencing network problems. And so we're going to ask him to turn off his video, hoping that might help stabilize things a little bit. And we turn it over to Florindo to talk specifically about how these flows are impacting Angola. Thank you, Florindo.
Well, thank you, Imani, and good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. So by now, I'm sure you have heard about Luanda leaks, as Ian alluded to, and this is just one out of several cases in Angola and throughout the continent, unfortunately. So I was reading a report from Brook Institution not too long ago, and the numbers of capital, illicit capital flow or outflow is staggering. It's just unbelievable. Since 1980, for instance, a report from Brook Institution estimate $1.3 trillion left sub-Saharan Africa from illicit financial flows. It's a report from the Global Financial Integrity that they have compiled. So, but focus on going back to Angola, I would like to share with you some numbers just to give you an idea, the scope of the issue, and where we are as a nation, that even a stable internet, we cannot have it. I mean, leave alone the hospitals, public hospitals and universities, and the trash on streets and the capital of Rwanda. It speaks for itself, how Angolan was devastated, just because of the illicit capital flow, when we're making billions of dollars, when the price of crude was $100+. There was a report done by Onango Abwe, is a scholar who he has compiled really a tremendous amount of data, and then he was looking into different places, including Angola, in regard to a capital outflow, inflow in Angola, South Africa, and other places. For Angola, for instance, it's estimated in 2009, 2014, and 2015. So there were $15 billion left Angola in 2009. In 2014, there were $13 million left, and then it just got worse as the next years, 2015, there were $21 billion. So it's a lot of money that left Angola. But how did all this money left Angola? That's really the question men have asked, and reports like Rwanda Leaks have trying to unpack how individuals like Isabel dos Santos, Manuel Vicentes, General Cupelipa, and General Dino, and so many have managed to steal billions and billions of dollars from Angola coffers, and left Angolans with almost nothing to survive. So so just to give you an idea, I will ask Iman to share you some of the numbers that we managed to compile from Brook Institution report. I don't know if Iman will be able to share that with us. I know my internet is not stable as well. So as you can see, it just gives you an idea where the top African emitters of illicit flows from 1980 to 2018, who are they? So we have on the top South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Angola, and Republic of the Congo as well, in addition to Democratic Republic of Congo. And the list goes on. It's just so you can see that's a tremendous amount of capital leaving those countries, including Angola. And then it also tells us, there's another table that tells us where this money is going. And this is, those are the top destinations of illicit financial flows out of Africa. So we have Mexico, we have Bahrain, Russia, Ukraine, Benin, Niger, Hungary. But we have, before that, we also have, if I can see, just give me we have China, United States, Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, Sudan, Belgium, and it list keep going on. So it really explains the relation between the autocratic regimes or individuals who work for a government, in this case Angola in particular, how they manage to get those funds out of Angola. But then there's also, I mean, a question of how can you move billions of dollars? We very often when we talk about Isabel dos Santos, of course she's not the only one who have stolen, or managed to steal billions of dollars. We have other individuals, as I mentioned, Manuel Vicente, General Dino, and Cooper Lipa. The list keeps going on and on and on, including the current president, João Lourenço, who also have benefited from corruption. He publicly accepted that he too benefited from. So in Angola, the elite, they managed to create banks, actually. Banks, they created this network of different banks that connected them with Portugal, that they would launder the money from Angolan banks with a representation in Portugal. So once it's in Portugal, it's within EU, then it's became almost unaddressable. And of course, I mean, in addition to several advisors from different Western countries, including the US. I mean, we talk about really top consult companies, PwC, McKinsey, Boston. And those are very powerful with tremendous know-how, with a lot of tools in the box that they manage to circumvent the laws in not just in the US but other places, and manage to help Isabel dos Santos and so many individuals connected to former President dos Santos and his crony to steal billions of dollars. It's uncertain, so it's not certain how much money they managed to steal, but there are reports that indicated we talk about probably more than 400 billion dollars have gone, but it's almost impossible to know because we're still today trying to find out the exact number of money that have been stolen from Angola coffers, and so there's a large work from those individuals, politicians, the Western advisors, and to the banks that they were supposed to probably they circumvent some of the local laws as well, and the shell companies, as Ian has alluded to, and so the U.S. actually you can open a shell company. The Biden's state, Delaware, is one of the known states where you can open a shell company, and basically it's almost impossible for members of civil society to find out who those companies belong to. And so that's how Isabel actually managed to open her company in Delaware. And she's not the only one. I want to make sure I emphasize this because as we keep focus on Isabel dos Santos, we still have a number of Angola, either former or current officials, who are still engaged in this type of activities. And it didn't end. We're still experiencing because those banks, a lot of those banks, they still have connection. They have office in Portugal, and so, and they have become more sophisticated. Those Angolan officials, how they can launder the money and manage to take from Angola to EU or Bahrain, other places in the world. So what are the real consequences here in Angola for the everyday citizens? As I walk in the streets of Luanda and elsewhere, and I talk to people, it's heartbreaking. See a young Angolans on the street, just sitting without looking for an opportunity to make money and feed their families. I mean, literally thousands. And then you go to the hospital, it's almost like a death sentence once you get there. As I was talking to someone, an employer of one of the hospitals here in Luanda, he looked at me and he said, well, I probably have more chances to die here in the hospital than elsewhere, just because of the conditions which is working under in a hospital. People are getting, there's no more beds. People are laying on floors, are laying in chairs, waiting to be, to someone to help them. The unemployment rate is extremely high. We don't have exact numbers just because it's extremely hard to get data here, but we talk more than 35 for sure percent in Angola, in particular among the youth and women here in Angola. And the government cannot even collect the trash in streets and downtown city. I mean, leave alone the periphery, the streets. We call them the bairros, right? The streets surrounding the capital of Luanda. So those are real consequences of illicit capital flow in Angola, where, I mean, the country was left for almost nothing. And so as the government increased the taxes, now the government's trying to tax almost everything. But Angolans actually don't have much to give. The poor part, the power purchase of Angolans is extremely low. So I think one thing I would ask, if I could, and we try to reach out to IMF and the World Bank several times and say, well, look, we understand you're trying to do business, but you do have social responsibility as well. You have to make sure this money that you're lending to Angolans, and we understand it's not free lunch, we have to hold accountable. You have to have a certain level of transparency on how this money has been spent, rather than keep lending the money and the money just going back either to US or going to China or elsewhere, because that's where they're buying real estate. That's where they are buying a piece of art. And that's where they save the money that have been stolen from Angola. So I think it's important, and I was happy to see the Biden administration speaking about corruption in tax haven and listed the financial flow as the priority of this administration, and national security priority as well. And so that's a good news. So the question really is, how can we make this into practice? We have been dealing with this issue for decades now, and the consequences are real. It's also explained the number of Angolans traveling all the way to Brazil, to Mexico, to trying to enter US. It's all linked to immigration. It's all linked to democracy. It's how our democracy has been eroded, and how it's hard for you to strengthen democracy, including Angola, because it's really, there's no accountability.
Lorindo, thank you so much for providing
and I think institutions
and details. We are seriously eating into our time for discussion. So hoping that maybe we could make that shift, and then I'm sure that others will be asking you for additional details. And with that, understanding that we only have less than 20 minutes or so for questions, what I'd like to do is to ask people to please put your questions in the Q&A box. We can pick up questions from the chat. It's it's just an extra sort of logistical piece that we have to carry out. As people are thinking about questions to place in the chat, I'd like to do one thing that I would ordinarily be done in closing, but I don't want to lose this one thing, and that is to thank the folks who really helped make this event possible. Obviously, the presenters themselves who've shared their time and their resources, our technical host, the Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Support Coalition International, or TASC, and TASC's Executive Director, Leonce Baimana, has lent both his skills and resources to really make this event a success. Africans Rising, also thank you for streaming this live. And then also the members of ADNA's Accountability Working Group, which was really, sort of the muscle behind this event, and all those who've been working behind the scenes of this event, and tweeting and carrying out other functions as well. So if we can now move to the Q&A. The first question I will take on. The first question was basically, are there names and affiliations and websites and so forth? And absolutely to all of those questions. And we will send out to each of you by email the list of the presenters and the link to their websites as well. Moving on, there are two questions actually that are related to China. And so I'm wondering if our presenters could first of all turn their videos back on so we can see you, and unmute yourselves. And to those of you that feel most comfortable in answering this question, I'm wondering if you could take that on. What about the flows to China that are double that to the US? What role is China playing in terms of illicit financial flows? And relatedly, Roberta Spalding asks if the contract is written in yuan, how does this affect the situation? So who would like to take those two China-related questions on? I see, Ian, you've unmuted yourself. You want to carry that out? Carry that on?
I was hoping Alvin might take a stab at that one.
You're both unmuted, so
okay. So I'll attempt to respond to it, and then probably Ian can come into. So there's been a lot of conversation about the role of China in Africa's development, and of course there's emerging conversation about the role of China in abetting illicit financial flows. And for me, really, the short response to this is that there is, number one, you can summarize to really the question of the size of the room. I don't think that there is a significantly different role that Chinese multinational companies play compared to American entities or compared to European entities. The difference is the same. The routes that they use, the channels that they use is practically the same. So there's fundamentally no difference in the kind of corporate behavior Chinese companies. When we talk, for example, of the abuse of double tax agreements, they'll end up using the same conduit countries when channeling their investment into the country. This could be Mauritius, it could be the Cayman Islands, it could be British companies or European multinational companies would use. And in terms of corporate behavior, I will not draw a difference to in terms of the destination of illicit financial flows. Where the challenge comes in, I think, is that when it comes to either access to information or when it comes to capacity to engage. Ian is doing and group under the FACT coalition. Organizations such as ours creating this kind of relationship to Chinese civil society organizations is virtually not possible. So the ability or possibility of engaging Chinese government in pushing some of these transparency agendas is rather limited if you were to draw a comparison to the US. Again, the work that the Building Bridges Initiative would be doing when in terms of the engagement and building those bridges between African civil society organizations and the US civil society organizations. So the conversations, for example, we're having now would practically not be possible. So generally, when it comes to access to information, it can become more difficult in terms of accessing the financial records of the Chinese companies because of how China has positioned itself when it comes to the global transparency. But in essence, when it comes to behavior, corporate behavior, I will not see any big difference between Chinese entities and any other corporate entity.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot to add to what Alvin said. And certainly in terms of the global movement to address illicit financial flows, to put together registries of the beneficial owners of companies, China really hasn't played a part in that. So it's much more difficult to access information. It's much more difficult to have a shared law enforcement strategy when it comes to Chinese companies. And a lot of the Chinese state-owned companies or state investment in different countries sometimes takes a very kind of public-private blended nature. So you see politically exposed persons from China setting up shell companies to bribe local officials in different parts of the world. So it makes it even more impenetrable when Chinese companies are involved in some of the other cases, which are still quite difficult.
Thank you both. So I'd like to lift up two questions from the chat. One is about action priorities. And I think that all of you have talked about the kinds of things in which people can engage. And I'm wondering if you have a sheet or a list or someplace on your website where folks can identify specific asks. That's one question. And then also there's a question about, could you please talk more about the link between illicit financial flows and privatization of public services? So those two questions, how do we follow up on the action items that you've identified? And could you talk about the link between illicit financial flows and privatization of public services? Alvin, I'm wondering if we can turn that last question in particular over to you. I would bet that the ITUC has, the Trade Union Confederation in Africa has probably looked at length into the relationship there.
Yeah, I think the relationship is very apparent. When you look at the arguments that is being made behind the privatization, we saw far back as in the early 80s was that the private sector is able to do it better. Like if it's a provision of education, that the private sector can do it better, and provision of infrastructure, the provision of healthcare, the private sector can do it better. The reason for this argument is basically that the government don't have the resources to do it in the first place, that government lacks both the technical capacity, but also the financial resources to do that. And the arguments that have been made in pushing this back is the number one, that the resources are there, but these resources are not being, the capacity to mobilize these resources is being undermined by illicit financial flow. So there is that direct connection that if we were to curb illicit financial flows, we'll be able to raise the necessary revenues that are required to be able to provide all the public services that the government is supposed to provide. And second, of course, the obvious question about accessibility, the privatization of education that we have seen across the continent has, of course, led to a very exclusionary system where when we are basing education on affordability, of course, it's the poor that suffer and carry the brunt of that. And therefore, they really need to ensuring that public services are provided by public entities, and the public entities being governments. And therefore, we need to do everything possible to ensure that we are enabling the government to be able to do that. TGNA, I could share this with you, Imani, later on. We actually did a publication together with Education International that was specifically looking at the education sector and the investment that are needed into education sector, and the need to mobilize resources and the curbing of illicit financial flows. The same applies to the healthcare. We are just finalizing a paper that also tries to look at the investment into the healthcare systems across the country, across the continent, and the implications this has on curbing illicit financial flows. So you can't disconnect the provision of public services and the capacity of governments to be able to do that from the resources that are required to be able to do that, and therefore the need to curbing illicit financial flows to enable government to provide those resources, and also challenging the political narrative that informs the idea around privatization of some of these entities of public services.
Thank you, Alvin. Florindo, there's a question that's directed to you regarding what proportion of illicit financial flows, Africa drivers, destinations, and policy options would have been related or would have been tax revenues in Angola?
Well, so if I may, very quick, I just like to add that one way to understand the list of capital flow in Angola is also look at into the contracts that the government assigned to different private enterprises. So this is really the core. This is how you can understand. And Alvin has alluded to very well, but this is how you can understand it. Now, until today, it's very opaque, the system, how those contracts are given or allocated to individuals or companies, and this is how the money has been stolen, and including during the Dos Santos era. Now, going back to the question, it's hard to tell because we really don't have enough data in Angola. I could say probably a quarter of $1 billion, but the reality is that we don't have the data. And what we know is that there's a tremendous amount of capital that has been lost, not just through illicit capital flow. And in Angola, we have two, outflow and inflow as well. We have inflow issue as well, but we also there's a lot of tax issues where the companies, the government really don't have the infrastructure to kind of collect taxes, and they're starting right now, but it's not as sophisticated as let's say the US or Canada, and so because probably I'm not sure why. But and so I cannot give you a number of and because we don't have one. but the estimations are, and if we count from 1975, I mean, we talk about billions and billions of dollars for sure.
So we just have a few minutes left, and in a second, I'm going to ask each of the presenters to make 1 minute closing comments. 1 minute, that's 60 seconds, and I'm going to be firm on that. We have one question left in the Q&A box, and it's basically a question about introductory reading lists on this topic. There's a lot written on illicit financial flows. Probably 95% of it is not introductory. And so I'm going to throw that challenge out to each of our presenters to help us very quickly after this meeting come up with an introductory list of reading material on this topic. We've, at different points in time, different organizations have attempted, and a lot of information is out there that's still very, very good, just needs to be updated. So I'll be back in touch with each of you. Regarding that question of action that came up earlier, as mentioned, we will also try to provide specific action items from each of the presenters. I would just like to say that on behalf of ADNA, the kinds of things that we have tried to do on illicit financial flows really are advocacy related. We've made very specific recommendations to both the Biden administration and to Congress regarding what we suggest they do in reference to illicit financial flows. And, in brief, I will not read them all, of course, but it's critically important, we think, that the US government and the administration in particular, the Biden administration, work with African governments through the various international agencies and in whatever bilateral relationships make sense to actually make sure that this is on the agenda and that the full scope of illicit financial flows is on the agenda, not just the sort of the criminal activity, which does tend, as Alvin said earlier, to be the go-to direction of many. We also think it's important for the administration to really think about, and hopefully think about a comprehensive approach to tackling illicit financial flows. You could go to the US Congress today and speak with some members of Congress who will be fully fluent on these issues, and others who absolutely are unaware. That same disconnect shows up in the US government, in the State Department, and so on. And so there needs to be an awareness raising and an education within the government here. As Ian mentioned, the Corporate Transparency Act, groundbreaking, important legislation, and now the administration has to translate that into actual rules, regulations, and we want to make sure that that legislation is fully implemented according to its intent. So ADNA has those and other recommendations that we will be acting on over the course of this year. With that, I'd really like to just give every panelist 1 minute to kind of close out your comments. Why don't we start in reverse order? Florindo, a 1 minute comment.
Sure. Well, thank you, Iman, and thank you to everyone who makes this possible. This gathering extremely important. I'm grateful, and to everyone who's listened. I think there are things we can do in order to mitigate this issue. It's affecting real lives, and it's not just eroding our democracy, but it's also really putting on hold dreams and hopes of millions and millions of people, not just in Angola, but throughout the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian.
Thanks, Amani, and thanks to everyone who was involved in organizing this and putting together. We really appreciate the space, and I really hope that we have more opportunities to connect between the US and Africa. These are shared problems where we're seeing impacts both in the US and in Africa. I think linking the illicit financial flows to the inequality issue is extremely important, and as was raised by a question, illicit financial flows starve governments of resources that they need to provide social services and address inequality. And governments sometimes go for the easy thing, like a value-added tax, rather than the hard thing, like tackling illicit financial flows. So looking forward to continuing our collaboration to find shared solutions.
Thank you, Ian. And Alvin.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for the
Alvin, you might have to shut down your video
opportunity.
because you're
I
breaking.
think that for me, really the parting word, can you, or let me shut down my video. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Yeah, so I was saying there are really two things that we need to do. One is organize and mobilize. The solutions to illicit financial flows are known. All the technical solutions are out there in the public spaces. The reason they are not being implemented is because there's lack of political will. And this is a political struggle, and we need to break the resistance, and the best way to do that is organizing and mobilizing. Move outside the confines of technical conversations into, and that's why I'm really happy that there are questions about simplified manuals, entry-level manuals, because that's the only way we can really get these conversations into the spaces that really matter. And so through organizing and mobilizing, we definitely be able to achieve much more and ensure that the conversation is not being kept within the rooms of the experts.
Organizing and mobilizing. Thank you, Alvin. With those really important and central words, we're going to end our webinar. I want to thank everybody who's been a participant in this conversation. Again, want to thank our presenters and also our technical support team and Africans Rising for the Facebook Live stream. Thank you all. And we look forward to our next conversation. Have a good day.